Today we're looking at the Spanish-American War. In the 1800s, President James Monroe released the Monroe Doctrine that notified European powers of the United States' intent to prevent further colonization in the Western Hemisphere. In doing so, Monroe established the United States as the dominant power in the region and extended its sphere of influence. Despite the Monroe Doctrine, many European countries had colonial holdings, especially in Central and South America. Cuba, a small island nation in the Caribbean, was one such colonial holding. It was claimed by the Spanish. Cuban rebels began the fight for liberation in February of 1895. They opposed the harsh rule of their Spanish overlords an ocean away. This fight for liberation became known to the Cubans as the Cuban War for Independence, which lasted until 1898. The Spanish responded swiftly and cruelly, quashing the Cuban rebellion through brutal means. U.S. newspapers covered the rebellion and subsequent Spanish response. Sensationalized portrayals incited the U.S. population and precipitated the public demand for involvement in Cuba. The United States had a great interest in Cuba, not only to keep European forces out of the West, but also for trade relations of sugar and other goods. To help protect Cuba and to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, the United States docked one of its ships, the USS Maine, in Havana's harbor as a protective measure for U.S. interests in Cuba. Inexplicably, the USS Maine sank on February 15, 1898, making conflict with Spain a real possibility. Several newspapers in the United States at the time put the sinking of the Maine on the Spanish. Also, several forms of yellow journalism were used to help sway public opinion about Cuba and the conflict that was taking place. In early April, a Spanish armistice ended hostilities in Cuba. The Spanish government granted the island some autonomy through limited self-rule. However, in the eyes of the United States, these actions were too little, too late. Cuba is roughly 100 miles off the coast of Florida. Political and economic turmoil made the Cuban-Spanish altercation uncomfortably close. Adhering to the Monroe Doctrine, President McKinley wanted to eliminate European influence from the Western Hemisphere. On April 20, 1898, per the President's request, Congress passed a joint resolution engaging the United States in the Cuba-Spain conflict. First, the United States acknowledged Cuba's freedom and its sovereignty as an independent country. Second, the U.S. government demanded the swift removal of Spanish military presence. Finally, the resolution gave President McKinley the power to remove the Spanish forcibly if they refused to leave Cuba on their own volition. Spain immediately rebuffed the United States and refused to leave Cuba. The United States countered with a blockade of Cuba on April 22nd and put out the call for volunteer troops to engage in a military conflict. As a result, Spain declared war on the United States on April 24th, and the United States retroactively declared war on April 21st. Within a week of the onset of the war, the United States Navy, under the leadership of Commodore George Dewey, destroyed Spain's fleet anchored in Manila Bay in the Philippines. Manila Bay was the first battle in the Pacific during the war and was one of the United States' strongest victories. During the battle, American forces only suffered 9 wounded and did not lose any ships. Within 2 months, the United States occupied Manila, the capital of the Philippines. June of the same year, the United States Navy looked towards the capture of the island of Guam. After the arrival of the USS Charleston at Apra Harbor, Spanish commanders did not engage the American ship. This was due to a lack of gunpowder on the island, which prevented the Spanish from entering into battle. The next day, American and Spanish officials agreed upon the surrender of the island to the Americans. Closer to home, Admiral Pascual Severi of Spain attempted to elude the United States with the Spanish fleet located in Cuba. Once the fleet in the Santiago harbor was discovered, the United States resolved to destroy the Spanish ships by flushing them out of the harbor into the Caribbean. American landfall was made at Guantanamo on June 10th, followed by General William Shafter's troops on June 22nd and June 24th. Moving by land, they forced Cervera to sail his fleet from the harbor on July 3rd. He was met with U.S. fire and his fleet was decimated. 2 weeks later, General Shafter accepted Spanish surrender, and an armistice ended the conflict on August 12, 1898. The United States and Spain met on December 10, 1898, and they both signed the Treaty of Paris. Spain granted Cuba its independence while transferring Guam and Puerto Rico to U.S. possession. Additionally, the United States purchased the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. Congress ratified the treaty 2 months later on February 6, 1899, officially bringing an end to the short-lived Spanish-American War.